Hi guys, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So today we're going to carry on with Niçe. Yesterday there weren't many people around, and yesterday we talked about (212) and (213), and in (212) and (213) he makes this distinction between the origin of a practice and its meaning or its purpose, and he takes the case of punishment, and he thinks that the meaning of something, the value of something is one thing, the story of its origin is something quite different. And he thinks that for anything with a history, the meaning of that thing is going to have multiple meanings. There's a very famous quote in 213, which is that only that which has no history is definable. Yeah, and I think this is a good quote to have at the tip of your fingers when you run across some sort of old school analytic philosophers, where you can be, yeah, I'm sorry, if they ask you for necessary and sufficient conditions, something, and you can say, I'm sorry, this is something historical, and I agree with Niçe. So 212 and 213, I think, are important. And the idea that things have multiple meanings is tied to Nietzsche's perspectivalism. And so in addition to 212 and 213, I talked about essay 3:12. Yeah. So if you missed yesterday's class, make sure you've read essay 2, section 12, essay 2, section 13, and essay 3, section 12. Yeah, and I think they're sort of connected. Today's class, I want to start off by talking about essay 1, number 10. And this is where he introduces the idea of sort of the slave revolt in morality. And he has this idea that the slave revolt involves what he calls ressentiment, becoming creative. And he contrasts this sort of noble morality with the slave morality led by this sort of priestly caste. And he thinks that the noble morality is essentially affirmative. It's a morality of saying yes to life, saying yes to oneself. And it looks like the slave morality, contemporary Christian morality, is in some sense essentially negative. It's got this negation at the heart of it. And so if we just write section 110, essay 1, section 10 by itself, we may think that Nietzsche's just got a very bad attitude, a very negative attitude towards the slave morality, towards these sort of these priests. Now, essay 3 that I started talking about last time, though, one of the main sort of themes of the third book is about the relationship between the priests, this priestly sort of ethic of being a philosopher. And so he's got this idea that philosophers sort of wear the garbs of this sort of priest, they've got this sort of priestly garb. And so we've got sort of priests and philosophers somehow connected to each other. And in some sense, he's affirmative about philosophers. And then if you read some other passages, he says some stuff that makes that presents priests and this slave revolt in some sense, a very positive light. So you've got chapter 1, 6, but essay 1, number 6, essay 2, number 16, and essay 3, number 30. Yeah. So these are passages where there's a he sort of stresses the positive side of this slave revolt. And the positive side of this slave revolt is the idea that the basic idea of this, what he calls the slave revolt, is that you've got classes of individuals within the society who are unable, who lack power, they're slaves. Their will cannot express itself. They're not allowed to act upon the world. Yeah, so they're sort of repressed. Yeah, and this repression involves turning that sort of energy, that kind of anger, sexual desire, willpower, instead of being able to act on one's desires and to express oneself in the world. Nietzsche thinks that what we have is a sort of repression. And when these sort of desires are turned inwards, rather than torturing, informing the world, that when these things are turned inwards, we sort of torture ourselves. So Nietzsche said that human beings are the sort of only sort of self-torturing animals. We sort of torture our souls. We look at self-consciousness as a form of self-torture. We look inside and we ask ourselves questions. And through this process of self-torture, we become sort of interesting. We become, in some sense, the animal that stands outside of itself. And so I think numbers 1.6, 216 and 313, I think offer a sort of more positive evaluation of this slave revolt, of what Nietzsche calls the interiorization of man. And these passages, I think, passages that were very influential on Freud. So Freud's civilization and his discontent is a sort of reworking of Nietzsche's genealogy. And Freud also has this idea that neurosis, art, is a sort of sublimation of sexual desires. That we have these desires and urges that as animals that are living in a sort of ordered, civilized society, we can't act upon. And what happens is that these sort of drives don't go away, but instead of being turned outwards in action, they get turned inwards. Or they get turned inwards and they manifest themselves in other ways. Yeah, so these drives can manifest themselves in terms of unthinking violence. That's how it was in the time of the noble savages. Within today's sort of society, I think Nietzsche thinks that these drives end up manifesting themselves in terms of philosophy, religion, and art. Yeah, and so we have a sort of process of sublimation. So these priests, I think what's positive about these priests is that the priests are great creators of values. The slave revolt is a sort of revolution in values. It's a reorientation. It's a reevaluation of the world. And so I think Nietzsche's philosophy is about maybe this reevaluation of values has kind of reached a sort of dead end in 19th century Europe. And so I think Nietzsche's idea is to be a sort of there's going to be a sort of revolution in values. I think he thought that he was going to do it, and then he went completely mad and lost his marbles and stopped writing. But in some sense, the philosopher who creates these values in order to be a creator of values, so it looks like Nietzsche kind of values health. But one of the interesting things about these passages is really there's a kind of great creative value in a certain type of productive sickness. And maybe kind of creative philosophy can be a bit like that. Okay, so let's look at these passages. I want to look at 110, 1.6, 216, and 313. And then if I have time, and I almost certainly won't, I also want to talk about 130. Yeah. So I know there's a lot of reading with Nietzsche, but these are kind of some of the highlights that I think you should definitely read. And like there is a kind of overall story, an overall arc to the sort of show. It's quite a long one. If you just want to see some of the highlights, these are all ones I think you should look at. This is like the perspectivalism. This is about punishment and the difference between the meaning of punishment and its origin. Remember last time I said this whole book is called The Genealogy of Morals. It's about the origin of our system of valuation. And so one thing is that even if its origin is as Nietzsche described it, Nietzsche himself thinks that doesn't tell us what we should think about it. Yeah, an understanding of where something comes from doesn't give us an account of its value today. I think we're all born in blood and dirt. Yeah, this is a sort of Nietzschean idea. Yeah, that birth. And Nietzsche's a bit icky about sex and stuff. It's like, ooh, yeah. So all of that is a bit naughty and a bit dirty. But that's where we come from. But the fact that we come from there doesn't stop us kind of growing moustaches and listening to Wagner. This is the sort of idea. So our origin is one thing. Our current value is something different. So I think these sessions sort of raise the question about, so what's the status of Nietzsche's own project then? Why care about genealogy? If genealogy is one thing, questions about present meaning is something quite different. And I think one thing is that the history of the origin of something involves, part of it's going to be kind of this history of different meanings assigned to it. And then to understand the present meaning of something historical is to understand all of these different ways of interpreting a certain type of practice. So 110, this is on page 36. So this is about the slave revolt in morality. And there's a lot of good rhetoric here. I'm going to read some of it to you. It says, the slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment, and it's in French and in the German, itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. Yep. The ressentiment is sort of, and we're going to talk a bit about what is meant by ressentiment. But ressentiment is the French for resentment, but there's not an exact word in German for it. So it's supposed to sound a bit foreign. The ressentiment of nature that denies the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. So you're sort of dominating. These are people who are dominated, aren't able to get actual revenge. They're too weak to kind of kill the bad guy. So instead of getting a real revenge, they get an imaginary revenge. They get an inward revenge. They get a revenge by labeling the other person, calling the other person names in their head. Like, this guy's the boss of me, but I think he's a complete, whatever. Yep. While every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself, slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, what is not itself. This no is so the slave morality is the morality of good or evil, good versus evil, rather than good versus bad. For the nobles, good meant noble, strong, powerful, aristocratic. And bad just meant, weak, poor, slave, dirty. It's just, it's nasty stuff. The slave morality has the idea that good is opposed to evil. And Nietzsche thinks that in this distinction between good and evil, it's evil that is the positive concept. Yeah, so the slave morality defines what's good in terms of what it's not. So you've got this kind of domination, power, cruelty, violence, ego. And then the good, as opposed to evil, is humble, poor, patient, unegoistical, non-violent, soft. It's all of, but these are kind of goods that are finding opposite to this kind of monster. So this is the way in which the noble morality is affirmative. It says yes to itself. The slave morality is negative in that it says no to the other. But this no is a creative deed. So in some sense, this this no saying is something incredibly creative. This inversion of the value positing I, this need to direct one's view outward instead of back to oneself, is the essence of ressentiment. In order to exist, slave morality always first needs a hostile external world. It needs, physiologically speaking, external stimuli in order to act at all. Its action is fundamentally reaction. It's a sort of negation, it is a reaction against, it's the sort of person who doesn't have any power. You know, they go to work and people, I don't know, sort of disrespect them in various ways. I think we know people like this in sort of bureaucracies, and they're always looking out for people disrespecting them. They go home and see their partner and kind of telling them, this person gave me, kind of looked at me and didn't use my proper title, you know. Yeah. But maybe they're people who don't have very much power. Yeah. Whereas the reverse is the case with the noble mode of valuation. It acts and grows spontaneously. It seeks its opposite only so as to affirm itself more gratefully and triumphantly. Its negative concept, low, common, bad, is only a subsequently invented pale contrasted image in relation to its positive basic concept. Filled with life and passion through and through, we noble ones, we good, beautiful, happy ones. Yeah, so, and the attitude the good noble has to the bad, to the poor, yeah, is one of pity. Yeah, that you look at this, oh, I just stepped in a poor person. Oh, yeah, but kind of pity, mixture of sort of pity and disgust. And pity, I think, is a very Niçe kind of, pity is a very bad emotion. Compassion, you know, if someone feels pity for you, compassion for you, there's something sort of condescending about this. There's a sort of superiority of feeling pity for someone. That you only feel pity for someone who you see as lower. Yeah, this is the sort of idea. Yeah, so the well-born, the noble, this is on page 38, felt themselves to be the happy. They did not have to establish their happiness artificially by examining their enemies, or to persuade themselves, deceive themselves that they were happy, as all men of ressentiment are in the habit of doing. So these people, the sort of no morality just lives life, that inside, when they're healthy, they're just enjoying existence. Whereas the sort of, the people of ressentiment, us modern men and women, I think this is supposed to be us, none of us have this sort of noble morality. Yeah, we have to kind of deceive ourselves that we're happy, often by comparing ourselves to others. Yeah, oh, you know, I've got this and I've got that. Yeah, that we have a sort of self-worth that is comparative. For those of you who've read Rousseau, you might think that this distinction here comes out of maybe Kant said the two most important events of the 18th century were the French Revolution and the publication of Rousseau's Emile, great Rousseau's kind of most influential work in the 18th century. And Rousseau makes this distinction between amour de soi, which is this sort of positive self-love, a sort of unreflective self-love, and amour propre. Amour propre is a sort of a self-love that we have by making comparisons to others. Yeah, so there's a sort of amour propre is a sort of self-belief in oneself that's involved in how one compares to others. Yeah, it's a type of self-evaluation that isn't just a kind of, isn't just a kind of self-directed. It's a sort of self-direction that's other-directed. And Rousseau, yeah, I think this distinction is sort of analogous and is a to Rousseau's distinction. So the noble man lives in trust and openness with himself. So the noble Homeric hero, everything is open. There's nothing hidden. Everything is clear, clean, and above board. The man of ressentiment, in contrast, this is right at the bottom of 38, is neither upright, nor naive, nor honest and straightforward with himself. His soul squints. His spirit loves hiding places, secret paths and back doors. Everything covert, secret, entices him as his world, his security, his refreshment. He understands how to keep silent, how not to forget, how to wait, to be patient, how to be provisionally self-depreciating and humble. Yeah, so this, this is what the slave is like. If you look at Roman comedies, you have the slaves who are very crafty and have secret plots and plans. A race of such men of ressentiment is bound to become eventually cleverer than any noble race. It will honor cleverness to a far greater degree, namely as a condition of existence of the first importance. And so the sort of nobles just sort of act without thinking. If they want something, they do it. Boom. Yeah, it's now I think it's easy to read Nietzsche, and you read things like this. And I think a lot of, in Turkey, do you have incels? You know these guys? You don't know incels? Or is that how you pronounce it ingels in Turkish? I don't know. Yeah, you have these guys who, it's a sort of internet meme thing, but a lot of them become sucked into the radical right. You have these people who kind of think that it's called involuntary celibate. And they have this idea that kind of men are divided into chads. What's the opposite? There's a sort of macho man who gets all the girls, and then there's kind of weak, involuntary celibate, beta male. The alpha, yeah. And it looks like, I mean, this bit of Nietzsche, if you just read this by itself, you might think that Nietzsche is a sort of incel. It's like, like, it's like you've got the chads and the, what's someone on the internet, does anyone know what the opposite of a, not a nerd. There's if anyone's interested, you can look up. They're really, I mean, I think they're quite dangerous. So a lot of these groups can basically promote mass murder against women, and so there's a lot of these who sit at home, get sucked into kind of conspiracy theories, but at the same time have this sort of ideology. And I think if you read section 1.10, you might think Nietzsche's a bit of an incel. Yeah, it's that these nobles are chads, and then you've got the little weak alpha males and beta males. Yeah, I think that's the concept. So on one hand, this slave revolt, these slaves in some sense are full of ressentiment, they're twisted, there's something nasty about the origin here. But let's have a look at what else he has to say. So the sort of leaders of the slave revolt are going to be the priestly caste. And I think Nietzsche's idea is historically, you have the sort of aristocracy, and not everyone in the aristocracy can be a warrior. You have aristocratic families with younger siblings. So the younger brother will become a priest. They're kind of in the priestly caste, but they don't have the power. So they basically acquire this other type of power. Yeah, the power that isn't able to express itself. So in number 6, 1.6, he kind of talks about this priestly caste, and so these priestly class, his idea is that this sort of priestly class allied itself with the slaves and the workers and the poor, and led this revolt against their sort of older brothers. And these sort of priests are an offshoot of the aristocracy. And he talks about there is from the first something unhealthy in such priestly aristocracies, and in the habits ruling in which turn them away from action. So this is a kind of part of the ruling class that doesn't get to act. Yeah, and so they alternate between brooding and emotional explosions. So you have this kind of inability to act. You're kind of just thinking about stuff all the time, and then every now and again you do crazy stuff. Yeah, you might think kind of someone like Hamlet. you might think is got this sort of mentality. Yeah, yeah, and so now we might think he says a bunch of stuff that seems very negative, but then he says, for with the truth, everything becomes more dangerous, not only cures and remedies, but also arrogance, revenge, acuteness, profligacy, love, lust to rule, virtue, and disease. It is only fair to add that it was on the soil of this essentially dangerous form of human existence, the priestly form, that man first became an interesting animal. That only here did the human soul, in a higher sense, acquire depth and become evil. And these are the two basic respects in which man had hitherto been superior to other beings. So the sort of basic noble morality, you've got these, when he talks about these blonde beasts, I think he's sort of quite literally thinking that early man were just like animals. They didn't have any interior life. Yeah, there's a sort of, there's a time in human history where you have sort of human beings who haven't acquired the sort of humanity. You might think that kind of, you know, that between chimpanzees, but it's only with this interiorization that man becomes interested. Human beings become interested. Now, I think his sort of hypothesis here is this becoming interesting is connected to what today people self. One of the questions in primatology is kind of how did a bunch of apes evolve into human beings? Well, what's the sort of mechanism through which? Well, what's the fundamental difference between us and chimpanzees? Yep. And one quite popular theory it's sort of been popularized by the primatologist and anthropologist Richard Wrangham. He's got a book called The Goodness Yes, is that the essential thing about human beings is that we're a sort of domestic animal. Yeah, and there's lots of work on domestication and how domestication sort of changes a species in various ways. And the thing about human beings is that we seem to be the only animal that isn't just domesticated, but is self-domesticated. Yeah, what human evolution, the central part of human evolution is this self-domestication. And Wrangham thinks that this occurred in proto-human beings with the sort of weaker apes ganging up together and killing the sort of alpha males. So there was a sort of, he also looks at bonobos. So bonobos are kind of similar to chimpanzees. People know about bonobos? They're sort of fun. They're the sort of, instead of fighting, they have sex. When they get into fights, and it's a sort of matrilineal sort of, it's very kind of, they're quite cool. So if you're interested, and they're also less aggressive. So Richard Wrangham's sort of theory is that becoming human involved this self-domestication, and domestication involves selecting animals against aggression. So you know, they did this study of domestication in the Soviet Union. They had a bunch of wild sort of aggressive foxes, and they just, every generation, they just killed the most aggressive ones and didn't let them breed. And they did this for 50 years, and now you have animals that are much more like dogs. Yeah, and just selecting against aggression, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes together with that. But this is a popular thesis now in sort of primatology, this idea that human beings are domestic animals, that we're domesticated. And I think this is sort of Nietzsche's idea. And this is once again something, number 216 is a section that is also that you find kind of repeated by Freud. So this is on the discussion of bad conscience, of guilt. How did we become animals capable of feeling guilt? And his argument is that we got these pains, and then we interpret these pains as punishment. And I take it the inner distress we have is the sort of distress that comes about through domestication. You know, like think about animals that you take them from the wild and put them in the zoo. They get stressed. Animals in zoos are not happy. But that's what we are, sort of living in cities, living at close quarters with other human beings, and not immediately killing anyone we can and kind of just having sex whenever we want. This is like, these sort of constraints are constraints that the constraints of domestication and peace are the sort of constraints that means that we're sort of dissatisfied animals. Yeah. So he says that my own hypothesis concerning the origin of bad conscience. Yeah, has got to do with, says I regard, so he's going to tell us it now. I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness that man was bound to contract under the stress of the most fundamental change he had experienced. That change, which occurred when he found himself finally enclosed within the walls of society and peace. So human beings found a way to live together peacefully. They created laws, they created social order. People live together without killing each other. And that means they can't act. We can't act on our instincts. And so instead of acting on our instincts, these instincts are repressed. Yeah, and it's repression that is basically, Nietzsche thinks, the kind of source of, so semi-animals, well adapted to the wilderness, to war, to prowling, to adventure, that's what we are. Such use their instincts were disvalued and suspended. From now on, they had to walk on their feet and bear themselves, where hitherto they had been borne by the water. A dreadful heaviness lay upon them. Yeah, I believe that this sort of self-domestication, that there has never been such a feeling of misery on earth, such a leaden discomfort. And at the same time, the old instincts had not suddenly ceased to make their usual demands. So living at peace with others, it's not like all of our instincts have gone away. Only it was hardly or rarely possible to humor them. As a rule, they had to seek new and, as it were, subterranean gratification. So he says that basically our animal instincts, living together in society, our animal instincts are repressed. And when instincts are repressed, they don't go away, but they express themselves in all sorts of weird ways. Basically in terms of philosophy and art and, yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I think like Nietzsche obviously didn't study primatology and didn't know much about wild animals living together. So one thing I would say is that kind of he's very wrong to think that primitive humans were aggressive necessarily in this way. I think that maybe hunter-gatherer societies weren't so much like this. Hunter-gatherer societies tend to be quite egalitarian. The sort of societies he's looking at, I think, are going to be more like these sort of more settled type of economies, kind of after the rise of some form of agriculture, where you've got kind of some slightly, yeah, so, and then, I mean, yeah, so one thing is so that's one thing. The other thing is like, you know, most of the social animals are hierarchical. So horses, chimpanzees, dogs, wolves, yeah, and so you have hierarchy relations. So these animals, so I think the idea that, you know, like, you know, in chimpanzees, that you have an alpha male, and then the alpha male has access to females, and then the other males can either kind of get together in secret, or they can get together and fight the alpha male and try and take over. Yeah, so it seems to me like the life of wild animals. Yeah, these sorts of things are not specific, I think, to human life. I do think, though, that, I mean, the thing about human beings is that this sort of self-domestication story is that we are, in some sense, the least aggressive primate. So one thing is even with chimps are just very aggressive. Like a chimp gets annoyed and they fight. Yeah, and so chimps are not good at kind of brooding. Yeah, kind of chimps, I don't know, like human beings hold grudges. You know, like someone says something and rather than hitting them immediately, you kind of go off and you kind of put it in your little notebook and kind of 10 years later, you know, boom, you screw them over. I don't know. But this, with like human beings can sort of do this sort of stuff. Whereas chimps, yeah, so I think this contrast with animals who are living freely, I don't know, I think that many of the animals, if you look at them, do have very complex social lives. And a lot of the animals that we kind of are closest to us are animals that live in large groups where there's strong kind of hierarchies. Bonobos are a bit different. Bonobos tend to be a bit more, yeah. Yeah. So we've got bad conscience. Bad conscience, I think, guilt, self-blame, something like shame. And I take it that Nietzsche's got this idea that as human beings, we're beings who sort of feel pain. And in particular, we're dissatisfied because we're domesticated. We have this sense of dissatisfaction, because that, you know, that we just can't act on all of our instincts. Yeah. So we've got this sort of deep dissatisfaction. That's one thing. So we have this feeling of dissatisfaction. And this is something that is sort of meaningless for us. So Nietzsche says that it's not pain that's bad. Pain itself isn't that bad. What's bad is meaningless suffering. What's bad is and so we're the sort of animals that are sort of interpreting that. So when we've got this pain sort of, this suffering just demands some explanation. And so Nietzsche's idea is that, so he thinks that the Greeks, the sort of archaic Greeks, the Homeric Greeks, had an explanation that was fairly healthy. So what did the Homeric Greeks say about this suffering? How do we interpret suffering? It's entertainment for the gods. The gods, you know, like life is a spectacle watched by the gods. And if, you know, our suffering is entertainment for the gods. So the kind of, I think these guys had this sort of, the ancient Greeks had this sort of aestheticization of suffering. This suffering is entertainment for the gods. So the suffering of mankind is theatre, sport, entertainment for the gods. And you would think that another version of this is going to be the idea of pain and suffering as the source of art. So you might think that modernized version of this is the function, the purpose, the meaning of suffering is you can turn this suffering into literature. I think this is sort of Nietzsche's "Das spoke Zarathustra." So he probably had sex once in his life, sick of this. The girl he loved with got together with his best friend, told him to piss off, you know, and he's really miserable. Yeah, he can't get any, he's sexually frustrated, and he goes off into the mountains by himself, doesn't have any friends, wants friends, and then kind of is like, okay, rather than treating this as meaningless, this is going to be the source of great literature. I'm going to write Das spoke Zarathustra. So one way of kind of interpreting this is to say it's entertainment for the gods. You know, this is the Homeric heroes, that they're fighting and killing each other at Troy, and the gods are on the mountains watching it, and you know, they love it. Or there's the stuff that's going to be turned into poetry. So the suffering of the Homeric heroes is the source of Homer's poems. So this suffering is going to be memorialized in poetry. It's going to be the source of poetry. The sort of the origin of bad conscience is another interpretation of our suffering. We interpret our suffering as we interpret this pain as punishment. And we've got this punishment for not paying back debts. So what is it punishment for? Well, we owe what we have to our community, to our forefathers. So he tells this story about how, first of all, we have to owe this debt to the community, and then we think of the community forefathers as the people we owe our debt to, and then these forefathers turn into God. And so, you know, we owe God all this stuff for creating us and looking after us. And then, you know, we somehow displeased God. We've displeased God by not giving God what God deserves. We didn't pray hard enough. We didn't sacrifice enough. We did the rituals wrong. Yeah. But this suffering is not meaningless. This suffering is punishment for some failure. Yeah. Why am I suffering? Because I did something wrong. You interpret the suffering. So guilt is when you feel this pain because you did something, well, guilt is when you feel a pain. And you interpret the pain as you feel this pain because you did something wrong. But Niçe thinks that the origin, remember last class we talked about the origin and the meaning of something and the function of something, that the origin of the pain is one thing. We interpret it as punishment. There's sort of pains we interpret as a sort of sting of conscience. Yeah. We interpret this pain as we blame ourselves. Yeah, so we have guilt involved in interpretation of some negative feeling. But the sort of idea is that, and this is, you know, we have self-blame. And Niçe is against guilt. He wants to get over kind of guilt and retribution and punishment. You know, you just get over your self-hatred, your self-blame. Yeah. And so he thinks that, yeah, so you asked me this question, is the guilt first, is the guilt the cause of the pain? No. That we interpret, it's a bit like saying, to say that guilt is the cause of the pain, is a bit like saying that punishment came about because of punishment. Yeah, why does punishment exist? In order to punish people. People deserve to be punished. And Niçe's story is that you get the practice emerges first, or the kind of physiological thing, sort of pain, the dissatisfaction. Then we sort of interpret it. And one way of interpreting this sort of self thing is, but once we've got this interpretation, so once we interpret this sort of pain as punishment, then we do all sorts of things to try and repay the debt we think we owe. And we end up in this sort of ever-deepening circle of self-punishment. Yeah. So, what time is it now? Okay, so let me just read 2:16, and then next class we'll start with 3:13 and then 1:13. So he says, all instincts that do not. Okay, so they had to seek these new and subterranean gratifications. Now this is the sort of Freudian bit. All instincts that do not, this is a really important passage, all instincts that do not discharge themselves outwardly turn inwards. if you've got some aggression, some desire, some urge, and you're not allowed to act on it, it sort of turns itself inwards. Yeah, this is what I call the internalization of man. Thus it was that man first developed what was later called his soul. The entire inner world originally is thin, as if it were stretched to membrane, expanded and extended itself, acquired depth, breadth, and height in the same measure as outward discharge was inhibited. So if you're not allowed to have a rich outer life, you have a rich inner life. Yeah. I think today children are too overstimulated. There's always games, they're always entertained. When I was a kid, we were bored a lot of the time. You might think in boredom, you kind of develop a sort of inferiority. These fearful bulwarks with which the political organization protected itself against the old instincts of freedom, punishment belonged amongst these bulwarks, brought about all of those instincts of wild, free, prowling men, turned backwards against man himself. Hostility, cruelty, joy in persecuting, in attacking, in change, in destruction. All of this turned against the possessors of such instincts. That is the origin of the bad conscience. So we're essentially aggressive animals. That's our animal nature. And if this aggression, if we can't beat up, torture things, be aggressive to things outside, we turn this aggression, anger inwards. Now, is this a bad thing? Well, look at what he says. He says some stuff about the suffering of man. Man is this suffering animal. He says, let us add once again, on the other hand, the existence of on earth of an animal soul turned against itself, taking sides against itself, was something so new, preferred, unheard of, enigmatic, contradictory, and pregnant with a future that the aspect of the earth was essentially altered. Indeed, divine spectators were needed to do justice to the spectacle that thus began, and the end of which is not yet in sight. A spectacle too subtle, too marvelous, too paradoxical to be played senselessly unobserved on some ludicrous planet. From now on, man is included amongst the most unexpected and exciting lucky throws in the dice game of Heraclitus's great child. There's a quote from Heraclitus about, you know that quote about how being is a child playing dice? Be he called Zeus or chance, he gives rise to an interest, attention, a hope, almost a certainty, as if with him something were announcing and preparing itself, as if man were not a goal, but only a way, an episode, a bridge, a great promise. So this kind of slave revolt is the kind of what makes us human. This emergence of a bad conscience is what makes us interesting. I think in 313 it's even stronger. I think the problem is that I think it's like, I mean, if you were Hegelian, it's like, oh, the kind of the Christian way of dealing with this has lost its creativity. It's become, it's reached the end of the way. And Niçe, one of the things that Niçe was really concerned about in 19th century Europe was basically nihilism. Yeah, where is this? Yeah, he thinks that that we've got to the end of this sort of Christian creativity. And what we find at the end of the 19th century is these two kind of things, nausea and self-pity. Yeah. So the post-Christian position is that the sort of worry is that humanity presents to itself nausea and great pity and disgust. And he sort of, yeah, he thinks that this sort of creative spirit that he's not advocating going back to being a blonde beast, yeah, because that's not the way to go. But he thinks that somehow this way of going through the problem, I mean, one problem is I would say he says it's not healthy. And it seems like you might think he values health over sickness. But then when you read some passages, so when we read this passage, he thinks that there's certain types of sickness that are productive. So just saying something's sick is not in itself, necessarily wholly negative. Yeah, so in some sense, it's not exactly sure which position Nietzsche holds. I think that kind of this is the whole plurality thing. I think Nietzsche thinks we should see all sides of this. Yeah, and there shouldn't just be one attitude we should have to these things. We should hold many perhaps conflicting and contradictory attitudes towards these things. And this is the healthy attitude and the sick attitude to have. Yeah, so what he says here about sickness, he thinks that because people are sick, the cure of sickness shouldn't be a healthy person, but it needs to be someone sick themselves. And so maybe this kind of philosopher of the future who Nietzsche sees in himself as being the kind of cure of this sickness, he has to be sick himself. Yeah. I think the final book, but by the final book of the genealogy, I think kind of the syphilis is kicking in more and more. So how much of this is manic ranting? Yeah. So bits of it, he's just going off on a bit of a rant. Okay, so I'll see you next class, and you'll start with 313 and look at 113. 113 is a famous birds of prey and the lambs, the lightning and the flash, being seduced by grammar. This is a good one. Okay, ciao.